Hello, welcome to another episode. I wanted to switch up gears today and not dive into politics just yet. I wanted to do something about one of the things I love, which is computers. I got my first computer very late. I was already, I think, in my 20s. I was like 24, 25 when I got my first computer. Maybe even 26. No, I got it before I joined the military, so it had to have been 22, 23. And I loved it. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I loved it. First one I had was a compact with a crappy everything, but it was cheap. So with the help of my mom, I got my first computer, and it was like a 15-inch CRT monitor that came with it. And then I was going to community college for computer information systems, and I gave that computer to my mom because they didn't have a computer. No one in my family really had. My uncle, some of my aunts, uncles, cousins had them, but my branch of the family was the poorest, so we didn't have it. But my mom co-signed a loan for financing to get a fully loaded compact. It had 900 megahertz Athlon processor. It had 256 megabytes of RAM, which at the time people thought I was crazy for getting so much. It just had a 7200 RPM hard drive. I want to say it was like 250 maybe 120 gigabyte. It had a zip drive. Most people probably don't know what a zip drive is, but it was an in-between floppy and CD. There was what they called zip. It was just these disks that could hold, I think it was 100 megabytes, so a lot more than a floppy, but not as much as a CD/DVD could hold. So I had an NVIDIA GeForce card. I think it was 32 megabytes of video memory. It had I don't know if it had a DVD drive. It might have just been a CD drive. And I got a 17-inch CRT monitor with that. And that's what I had for several years until I joined the military and after boot camp and A school. And my grandfather gave me the money to buy my first laptop, and that was a Sony Vaio. It was a pretty decent machine, but it didn't have dedicated graphics, which I'll dive into dedicated graphics. But the big thing with computers is you had two different battles. You had Intel versus AMD, which we're gonna try to cover most of the history on that, and then you had NVIDIA versus ATI. But then AMD bought ATI, they merged, and so now it's AMD versus Intel with processors and NVIDIA for video GPUs. The purchase of ATI by AMD is what made them really struggle for the last decade or so, because they took a huge loss when they bought it. But I think it was a good merger, or a good thing for them for AMD to do. It helped them develop their APUs and some of their other programs. So this goes all the way back to the 60s. Well, 60s when they were founded. You had Intel, was 1968 by Bob Noyce, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Gordon Moore. And you hear Moore's Law, I think that was the guy that did it. Again, I'm not positive, so if anyone wants to correct me, go right ahead. AMD was a year later, founded by Jerry Sanders, and he had a team of former Fairchild Semiconductor employees. And the battle really started in the 80s, because IBM, who was the only, the big giant for computers, they chose Intel to make the chip with Intel's x86 architecture, and then they chose Microsoft's DOS, or what we would be calling Windows later on. But IBM demanded that Intel find a second supplier. They didn't want to be solely dependent on Intel and Intel alone for their chips. They didn't want any kind of shortages, so they were actually thinking ahead. And they told Intel that they had to find a second supplier for them so they wouldn't be over-dependent. So in 1982, Intel chose AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. That's the name of the company, so you hear me say AMD, that's what Advanced Micro Devices. They signed a technology exchange agreement, and it made AMD the second supplier for IBM. And that gave them access to Intel's second generation 286 chips. But Intel doesn't like sharing very well. So in 1984, when they came out with their third generation, the 386 chip, AMD asserted that Intel was trying to create a PC chip monopoly by holding things back from them and not, sharing. So that's when the battle really started, and there was court filings. But in 1992, a California court finally ruled against Intel. They awarded AMD $10 million and a royalty-free license to any Intel patents used in AMD's own 386 type processor. So basically the court said, Intel, you're breaking the law, friggin' give AMD money because you caused them to lose money by withholding, and they get royalty-free, meaning they don't have to pay for any of the patents. And then in 1995, Intel and AMD settled all their legal battles with an agreement that would give AMD shared interest in the x86 chip design. And in 1999, AMD, required by the agreement, they had to develop their own chip. So in 99, they came out with their Athlon chip, which that was my second computer. My first one was the Intel Celeron, which was really garbage. If you ever had a Celeron, you know what I mean. They've gotten better nowadays, but back then they were just cheap and slow. And the Athlon chip was actually a very fast, very good chip. But at the time that I got my Athlon compact, my best friend at the time, Scott, his parents bought him a Intel compact. Now I had more memory, bigger hard drive, better video card. My processor was faster, but overall system, you couldn't even tell his computer was on when you went into his room. And in mine, it sounded like a spaceship was about to launch. And that's because Intel chips or AMD chips tended to be very, very, very hot. Even to this day, they're still, to me, they seem hotter than Intel. I finally built an Intel machine a couple years ago after I got hurt. All my the desktops that I built beforehand was AMD. I like the underdog, and their price performance couldn't be beat. You not only pay a premium when you buy Intel for the processor, but you're paying a premium. The motherboard's more expensive. Just everything involved with the ecosystem is more expensive than with AMD. Especially if you're on a budget, you can't go wrong. If you get an AMD APU, you don't need to spend money on a graphics card, which is one of the most expensive additions you can add to a computer. So, and the APUs are pretty good for people that do light gaming. If you need hardcore gaming, then yes, you're gonna have to have your settings so low it's not worth it, and you most likely can't do good 4K with it. But if you 1080 or lower and you just do light gaming, you can't beat the AMD. Especially if you're looking for a thin and light laptop, their APUs, in my opinion, are better than, unless you can afford discrete graphics, then obviously go for that. But let's get back. In 2000, AMD complained to the European Union saying that Intel was violating their anti-competition laws. And in 2003, AMD had their biggest breakthrough, and that was with its 64-bit CPUs. They were the first to come out with 64-bit. At the time of its launch, or the news of it coming out, Intel said, "Oh, we're going in a different direction," and they tried to just boost their speed, and they didn't want to admit that they were following AMD now, but they would in a couple years do just that, follow them. But their AMD's Athlon 64 chips were a great success. They were far superior, faster, cheaper. Everything about it was better than Intel's chips at the time, except for, their top of the line 1000 or however, their expensive chips are great, but who can afford that, that much? Also around that time, they introduced their server line processors called the Opteron. So you had Athlons were for consumer desktops, and Opteron was for their servers. In 2004, Japan, their Fair Trade Commission, raided Intel offices, and they found that Intel was stifling competition by offering rebates to 5 Japanese PC makers: Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC, Sony, and Toshiba. They would get these rebates from Intel if they agreed not to buy, or if they only bought a small amount of processors or items that had AMD's processors. So it was AMD and Transmeta. I'd never heard of them. I'm sure they're big. They were, not big, but computer people will know what they are. I never really heard of them. And that's the big thing. Intel needs AMD to have good products. Because when AMD doesn't, like the last couple decades, AMD has been really, their APUs are good or decent, but that's just because of the graphic side. The processor, the CPU side, complete garbage compared to Intel. Intel's i chips are phenomenal, but you would never have gotten Intel i chips if it wasn't for AMD. You might have gotten them, but it would have taken a lot longer. Without direct competition, AMD really doesn't innovate. They little minute changes per family. There's really not any big differences. You weren't seeing year after year. You were just seeing 4-core, 8-thread, 3 whatever gigahertz, and that was it. There's really been no major innovation. But then you had AMD just released their Ryzen CPUs last year, and they are awesome. Just for the price alone is great, and I have their Threadripper, which just got released a little while ago, and it is really a nice machine. I had a problem with in the beginning when they launched, because they have a massive amount of PCI Express lanes, but for some reason you weren't able to RAID M.2 hard drives. And I'm sorry, just want to put this out. All you people that have no idea about tech, what I'm saying probably sounds like gibberish, so I apologize. I will try to have different shows talking about the different technologies and different jargon. So the big thing in the early 2000s, you had the gigahertz wars. Who's the first to get to 1 gigahertz? Who's going to get the 2 gigahertz? And so on. And then around the 4 gigahertz, between 3.5 and 4, it was kind of like the roadblock for the speed. They weren't as stable, and there was just going past that wasn't that great. So then the new war was, how many cores can you have? Who was the first to get 2 cores? 4. They skipped over 3. I think AMD for a little while had a 3-core chip, but that little guy didn't last very long. So there was usually 2, 4, and then Intel had a bunch of 6s. AMD, there was a lot of hype, and I was one of the ones that were really enthusiastic about the release of their pile driver and bulldozer cores, but they just fell flat. They sounded great, but compared to Intel's i chips, there was no competition. They were still the price performance leaders because their chips are so much cheaper, but just in quality, they were not very good. Half of it was design, I think. The big half was just software and programs couldn't utilize all their cores because it was a completely different architecture, and they just wasn't good. like I said, Ryzen is really lifting them up pretty good. They just released a couple days ago the Ryzen APUs with the Vega graphics. So I haven't built one of those yet. It literally just the other day came out. I'm debating whether or not to build one for tethering to have on a little cart. So if I do any kind of studio photography or portraits and stuff, I have I think that would probably be good enough for tethering. I'll test it out. If not, I have tons of cards laying around. I can throw in a GPU and see if it'll crossfire with the built-in. But the way what Intel would do with their practices, like Dell for a long time was only Intel, because Intel told them, you qualify for these rebates and all this money will give you, or give you discounts up the wazoo, but you can't have, or you can't in any of your computers have AMD chips. And for a long time it was like that. And then finally, I don't know if the contract ran out, if the rebate ended, they had to stop it. But Dell finally has gotten, so, this is still mostly Intel machines, but they do have the AMD option for value for the cheaper models, for people that can actually afford it. Let's just see. All right. I'll give you an example of Intel and how just crazy the prices are. Intel's #1 chip is a very good chip, probably the best chip out there. It's the i9-7980 Skylake X. It has 18 cores. Not 1, not 2, not 4, 18. With 36 threads. Its speed is really slow. It's only 2.6 gigahertz. But this is the real kicker. $1,979.99. That's more than most people pay for an entire system. Monitor, printer, tower, everything. So for just one processor to cost that much is insane. Okay. Now, they also have an i9 that's 16 cores, 32 threads for $15.99. So now AMD's fastest chip is also a 16 core, 32 thread. Okay. Intel's is 2.8 gigahertz, AMD's 3.4. Intel's, as I said, is $15.99. AMD $8.99 for their Threadripper 1950X. That's a huge cost difference. For the amount of money you'd save just in the processor alone, you can throw in an awesome video card or get some really good M.2 drives, RAID 0, and you have an awesome machine for the amount you'd save. So it's just, and if I go down the list, it's like that everywhere. AMD's next chip is a 12-core, 24-thread for $749. Intel's is $1,110. And that's for the 12-core, 24-thread, both of them. You go down to 8-core and 16-thread, $569 for the Intel, $449 for the AMD. You go down to 6-core. AMD don't have a 6-core, but they got their regular Ryzen 7 8-core 16-thread versus Intel's base consumer chip that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. It's the Coffee Lake 8700K. It's 3.7 gigahertz compared to AMD's 3.6, but it's $374.99 for the Intel and $349.99 for the Ryzen. Now, yeah, that's not that big of a difference, but you're getting 2 more cores and 4 more threads out of it. And the motherboard costs less for the AMD machine. It just, overall, your computer cost is going to be a lot lower with the AMD. Now, even if the Intel is slightly faster, the amount of money you save on these chips, you can throw into things that will actually, you find yourself, your computer acting faster. Memory, video card, as I said, if you're into gaming. There's other areas of the faster hard drive. And the two chips they just released, it's the AMD Ryzen 5, the 2400G. Okay, that's a 4-core, 8-thread, 3.6 gigahertz for $189. So that's processor and video in one chip. Like those of you that are big Apple fans, the Apple Pros that just came out, they have a lot better chips, but they use Vega GPUs, and this chip has a Vega graphics built into it. It's not as fast, but Vega is a decent design. Then they got the Ryzen 3 2200G, 4-core, 4-thread, 3.5 gigahertz, and it's only $129. Now, I don't know why they went away from their A nomenclature, because for a while all their APUs were like A10, A8, A6, but this time they just went with a number, 4 numbers, and a G. So I guess the G is for graphics, maybe. Now, the cheapest chip that I could find on Newegg a couple days ago was the AMD Sempron 2650. It's only 2-core, 2-thread, but it's $24.72. So if you're on a budget, boom, you throw that in. I would prefer spending a little bit more and getting the $59.99 APU, the A6 9500. It's 2-core, 2-thread, but instead of 1.4 gigahertz like the Sempron, it's 3.5, and it has graphics built into it. You know, AMD. I don't remember what the name. I forget the name of their last chip, but it's for the price, phenomenal. So, if you're into looking for a budget machine, you don't have a lot of money to spend, definitely look into getting an APU from AMD, because they really do perform good. Thing I wanted to say most is a lot of my family asked me constantly, you know, how much was it going to cost to get a computer, or what, you know, what's the price for this or that. First thing you have to ask yourself when you're going to buy or build or have somebody build for you a computer is, what are you going to do with it? Do you have a business at home? Are you going to use it for graphics, gaming, or are you just going to use it for internet, email? You know, maybe some light little game, you know, like a pop-up game or something, like Mahjong Dimensions or any of those little games, Solitaire. You have to ask yourself that, because the higher powered stuff like CAD and video editing, even photo editing, gaming, you're going to need a more expensive computer just because of the graphics. That's a big difference in price between getting a machine that's integrated graphics, which means that it's built into the CPU like an APU, and discrete graphics. Discrete graphics are, you have a separate GPU, a graphics processor, and it takes care of anything graphics related, which leaves the CPU processor just to deal with the other items. So, and that's a big difference in price. In a lot of places, when you go to do a search for computers, if you look on the where they have their little different criteria or search items, you'll probably see dedicated versus integrated. If you need something with a lot of graphics power, definitely get dedicated or discrete. Integrated, as I said, is for more of the light gaming. It's a lot cheaper, but it can't handle, you know, real games and real editing and graphic design type stuff. Besides just what you're going to do with it, how are you going to use the tower? Because you have a lot of different platforms. You know, if you just want something to play games and something to check email and do a little internet, maybe you just get a tablet. So it's pretty cheap. It's extremely mobile, and they've come pretty far from the original ones. But then up from that, you got obviously choices of laptop versus desktop. But then even in the desktop, you have a couple choices. You know, do you want a tower and a monitor separate? Or do you want what they call an all-in-one? which is there is no tower. Everything is built into the monitor, and then you get a keyboard and a mouse, and you're good to go. Obviously, if you want the fastest possible, you have to stick to a tower and a separate monitor, because just space-wise, the faster a computer gets, the more heat it generates. The more heat it generates, the bigger cooling you need. So towers, just standalone towers, provide the best cooling options. And they've made strides, and all-in-ones can get pretty powerful, but I guarantee you they're going to sound like airplanes taking off. So those are some of the things you gotta look. It's not just a simple I want to buy a computer, because you have tons of options. Even in just laptops, you got a traditional laptop, you got 2-in-1 laptops, you got touchscreen laptops, non-touch, Apple, Windows, and the Windows 10. If you haven't used a Windows 10 machine yet, I love them. To me, it's the best Windows out. I love mostly the OneDrive. I love being able, no matter what computer I get on, all my files that I save are there. All the passwords, everything. It's seamless transition. I wish the Windows Phone had gotten better apps, because I would be in all Windows right now. I would have got rid of Android, Apple, and just stuck with Windows, just because I love the ecosystem. Being able, no matter which one I'm on, to be there. Like, I had the Windows Phone for a little bit, and it was great for if I took a picture or did something, it would go to all my different Windows machines. But hopefully I didn't talk for that long. I have a feeling I did talk a lot longer than I wanted to, and I wanted this to be short. Next video I'm going to do is probably going to be a family story of my grandfather, how he got here, and how I eventually came to be. And then I'm going to do another quick political to talk about the current events that's been going on. So I'm going to try to squeeze that out a little later. But until then, thanks for watching, and see you soon.